imagination of human rights. And it is something that I think feminism has brought to the table for all of us everywhere in the last 40 or 50 years. The promise of feminism is not just that we can rewrite the rules, but that we can imagine and we can become different people, no longer bound by the restrictions of patriarchy, by the repressive force of gendered roles, no longer inhibited in our physicality, no longer repressed in what we do with our bodies, no longer forced to be mothers or fathers, or not to be mothers or not to be fathers. It implies a liberation of the human personality, which is really beyond the kind of standard repertory of what human rights can claim. Earlier, I said that I thought it's very important to remember that human rights are connected to needs in a fundamental way. And for me, starting human rights work where I did, very much at the grassroots, in Romania in the 1990s, in a situation where there really weren't any human rights organizations doing the kind of work that my friends and I were doing, we understood that there was a very direct connection between rights and needs. That when people said, I have a right to something, what they were really saying is, I need this. I need my physical freedom. I need not to be afraid of the police. I need not to be afraid for my life. I need not to be afraid of arrest for being who I am, or loving who I want to love, or desiring who I desire. I need not to be afraid of torture. I need food. I need water. Out black coal dust, as they did all over Romania after 40 years of environmentally negligent rule. So these were all fundamental needs that people were expressing. And I think a liberatory politics starts where we attend to needs, where we stop thinking about the legal niceties and is this really a right, and is it in the conventions, and how do we communicate this in advocacy terms to an indifferent state, but where we say this is a fundamental need that people have. Marx, to go back to Karl Marx, who's been very important to me in many ways as a thinker, and also a Hungarian philosopher who was influenced by Marx, Agnes Heller, they both argued for a concept of radical need. Radical need is a kind of need which is so profoundly unmet by the existing system of things that to meet it would involve shaking, deconstructing, reconstructing, or changing that system in a fundamental way. A radical need is a need that people in power are scared of, because to meet it would destroy their power. And freedom from torture in Egypt is a radical need, because the regime is based on torture. Freedom from policing in its current form is a radical need in the United States, because for 200 years, American white supremacy has been premised on policing. Water in South Africa, or food or housing, are radical needs, because under apartheid and under the regime that has succeeded apartheid, the system was simply not interested in providing these, and was built on not having to provide these at all for the majority of the population. When we start from what are the needs, what are the really radical needs that are not being met, and I think that's also a feminist principle. It's the principle at the heart of the old feminist adage: the personal is the political, because need is personal. Need is something we find in ourselves. When we start with need, we're also putting ourselves on a road that points us toward liberation, that points us toward a liberatory politics, and it's only by kind of getting on that road too, by understanding itself as rooted in need, that I think human rights can become a fully liberatory practice, can explore its own liberatory potential.
Amazing, amazing. I love that. Thank you. Thanks. So, Africa is another part of the world that's very badly
Uh,
misunderstood by a lot of us in the West. So, tell us about some of the activists you know there and the root causes, which you already got into, of maybe do a few more ones of the human rights violations in Africa and how we can be in solidarity with the people there.
um, Africa is one of the places where this politics of moral panic got to start. In figures like Robert Zimbabwe, almost 30, or Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe almost 30 years ago, who um, invented and perfected the technique of singling out LGBT people or demonizing one minoritized identity as a way of mobilizing political support. And that kind of strategy has spread around the world. I think, though, that we also need to look at the way that African movements have responded to this kind of demonization and have built coalitions and have built effective movements, because that's also a model we need to emulate. The model of organizing, which comes from South Africa, the model of progressive organizing that comes from South Africa should be a model for the rest of the world. The model of LGBT organizing that comes from South Africa going back to the 1990s also should be a model for the rest of the world. Well, what do I mean? The United States is now being presented as the world model for how you achieve LGBT rights, even though we still don't have a nationwide law on discrimination, we still don't have constitutional protections. The way that the United States LGBT movement has operated, I suggested this earlier, but it's largely been through mobilizing elites and mobilizing money. And that's worked in the United States because we live in an increasingly oligarchic society, but it's not a model for the rest of the world, which is not quite so oligarchic yet. And it's not a model for a world in which, in fact, popular movements of the dispossessed, not the possessors, have been powerful and effective routes to social change. In South Africa, the LGBT movement succeeded in the 1990s because LGBT activists had been involved in and vocal in and visible in the anti-apartheid movement for 10 years. They built coalitions. They built common understandings around equality. And when the new constitution was passed, was argued out and passed between 1992 and 1994, they were able to make the case to the rest of the anti-apartheid movement and to a broader population that equality had to be defended in the Constitution with no exceptions, that sexual orientation had to be included as a protected class. And as a result, South Africa became the first country in the world to include sexual orientation in its constitution as a protected identity. Eat that, United States. It was South Africa which led the way, and it led the way through progressive coalition politics. That's the kind of thing we need to be emulating. It's something which has also been a hallmark of LGBT organizing elsewhere in Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, even in Egypt, where organizing has been much more underground, but it's also operated through effective coalitions with the rest of the left. I just want to mention at this point the example of Latin America also, where in the 1980s and the 1990s, LGBT activists also were deeply involved in leftist activism against the dictatorships and in fighting for democracy in country after country, from Argentina to Uruguay to Brazil to Colombia to Venezuela to Peru. And one of the results has been that their concerns have been heard by the left in Latin America. And Latin America now has countries with some of the most wide-ranging and comprehensive protections for LGBT rights, for trans rights, for sexual rights anywhere in the world. Look at Argentina, which is another model that really puts the United States to shame. And it's because of popular mobilization and coalition. That's something we have not been good at in the United States. And we need to learn from countries where it has worked. We need to get away from our faith in oligarchic politics and corporate mobilization and learn from countries where coalition politics and popular mobilization have actually been the path to progressive change.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And gonna go off script again. You've
Sure.
been pointing out a lot of like the big mainstream human rights organizations and various problems with the way they're doing things nowadays and all of that. So what are some of the human rights organizations you've noticed which are doing a better job?
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna, I don't want to spend too much time bashing, say, Human Rights Watch or outright International for that matter. They do good work in many ways. I think they don't need as much money as they do, and I don't think they need to claim the centrality in human rights organizing that they do, or that they try to claim. But I think more modest versions of themselves would be very successful. I'll just say a word for the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which is an NGO based in New York. That it's a very small NGO, headed by a friend of mine. It works for social justice and against poverty and inequality. It works to make economic and social rights an equal and vital part of the human rights constellation, works in cooperation with a lot of local activists around the world, and I think they really do excellent work. I also want to point to the Sexual Rights Initiative, which is a collaborative network that was kind of founded under the auspices of a Canadian reproductive rights organization, but it's really a kind of collective enterprise of a number of organizations working on sexual rights from across the global south. They primarily do advocacy at the UN, but they've done a very effective job of amplifying the voices of Southern sexual rights advocates at UN and international fora. There are a lot of groups in India whose work I respect profoundly. CREA has also done a huge amount of work in training sexual rights advocates and in helping them carry on advocacy in international fora. Dawn, which is a group based partly in Brazil, working across the global south, has done incredible work advocating for women's rights and sexual and reproductive rights, and again, empowering activists across the south. I think, there are probably many more that I can and should think of, but those give an idea of what I think are important values in human rights now, which are decentering the hegemony of the global north, foregrounding grassroots voices and voices outside that New York, Geneva, London circuit, offering a holistic vision of what human rights are. They're not just civil and political rights. Economic and social rights are vital. Talking about inequality and talking about the material bases for rights is absolutely critical at this juncture in time. I think all those groups are doing critical work in defending and trying to articulate a vision of a real democracy.
Thank you. And similarly, what would you recommend